All right,
All
Stacey,
right.
you want to kick it off?
Yeah. Yep. Okay. This would be like kind of a 50s thing, but like a 1950s thing by way of the 1970s, almost like Linda Ronstadt. We're doing this or something. Okay. I'm
right.
hoping there will be a little rock sax right at the end. Writing is exciting, but so is running a show. Runny. You can be the boss if you're the runner of a TV show. Bossy. And that's why our podcast is called The Showrunner Show.
Oh, yeah. That was great.
This is the sax solo.
And then sax solo. All right, well done. Welcome to the Showrunner Show, where every week we demystify some aspect of the job of showrunning for anyone who works in TV, who wants to work in TV, or just wants to know how it's all made. I'm John Eric Dowdle.
I am Stacey Shabosky, and we are here with our wonderful guest for week 2 with Ken Segna.
Yay!
Segna. Ken Segna.
Exactly.
Yeah. So last week we talked about kind of the function of the studio and networks and the multiple entities. This week, we wanted to really dissect like what makes a great relationship with a showrunner. Like, I'm sure you've had your sample size of, showrunners is like far greater than like any showrunner. You just know what you do, but you don't really get a chance to see how other people do things.
Yeah.
So we wanted to just ask like, kind of like what do you think makes a great showrunning partner?
Oh, man. I mean, first off, I find the job of showrunner kind of like an impossible thing for a single human to do. It's kind of then wrestling with, how are you setting things up, setting the person and the show up for success. Because it is there's so many different hats to wear in one role. And I don't think I've met anyone who is good at every single facet of it. I think that's not a real thing that someone could probably do. And maybe there's somebody out there. But, it's like, everyone has their strengths and the things where they are going to look for help and support. And that, I think, kind of going back to what we talked about last time, helping kind of build a team, that is going to, you have, kind of person that's really the showrunner, but like is going to help support in the right way. And so I think like definitely the three things that I'm always like, especially when I was on the network side, but I mean, also on the studio side, just kind of as you're putting it together, the things that I would always look for are like, one is vision and voice, so that you kind of like, and on the network side, especially, I would always talk about like, do you have that North Star? Like when you're in the pitch, do you have kind of the North Star of the story they're telling? Or like another way to put it would be like, I always like by the end of a first episode or even in a pitch and just talking to somebody about the show and the story they want to tell, almost feeling like, all right, you've just pointed out the top of that mountain. And I know we're going to the top of that mountain. I have no idea what it's going to look like when we get up there. And I have no idea how we're going to get there, but at least I'm always directed in one way. And so I kind of get what ride I'm on. And it's so easy, I think, to lose sight of, kind of that North Star amid everything in a show. You want to see that somebody has a vision, has a voice, has kind of that center to constantly be reminding. So it's like vision, voice, team building, and, really, I think thoughtfully putting together the group that is going to make a show and the support around them. And then decisiveness. I think like if you've got the vision and you've got the right team and you can move fast, like there's kind of no stopping you. It's just easy to say, just get all those things. It's like, it's very hard. And then even then, I think you just like to make a successful show, it's like you got to do all that stuff. And then you got to have a little luck in terms of the timing and all of it. So, that's, I think the fun part, but the maddening part of it all.
Yeah, that's it. Well, I would even say the luck, like, often like, you don't know like the actors in a way, like where are they at in their lives? Is one of the actors going through a divorce or has developed a drug habit over COVID or whatever? Like, you know what I mean? Like there's so much luck, or, you know, this actor you were worried about and they show up like just crush it. You know what I mean? There's so many, I don't know, just so many variables in everything. Or this network becomes something bigger or something smaller or whatever. You know, you just never know.
Actually, I want to like totally steal that and revise my answer and add a fourth one. Which is like being nimble, frankly, because I feel like everything that you're talking about, it's like, and that's where I think like the vision and the team become, and the decisiveness become important, because you're like, you're gonna be up against it. It's like that. I always get this quote wrong, but that, you know, the general that said like the first casualty of the battlefield is the battle plan. You know, you kind of like
I love that.
Go in with the plan and the team, and then it's just like immediately going to get thrown out the window. But at least you know what you're trying to do, and then you have to like kind of pivot within that. And to your point about actors, production issues that crop up, like just all the stuff that there's no way you would have known was going to come. I feel like you set yourself up to tackle that stuff if you got kind of like that foundation, and you know, you just roll with those punches from there.
I got to say, you know what I find really interesting and a little surprising in your list is you don't have openness or works well with others. You know what I mean? That seems to be, I guess, or collaborative, or you know what I mean?
Team building, I think, is like, in my mind, captures that, because I think it's like if you are good at team building, it's like you have to know other people's strengths, and you also have to know your own strengths and weaknesses, and you got to be able to communicate those. Like, so I guess, I'm like, that's a little of a catch-all for that, because 100%, like, I don't think you can have a team if you don't, like, for real, like, if you don't have everything you were just saying. Being, I think, a good manager, a good leader, you gotta have that. Otherwise, you know, it's not an effective team, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's like, you know, when you're like, you know, earlier in life dating someone and you realize like, oh, this person doesn't have a single friend, you know, that they've had for more than like 2 months. Like, you know what I mean? Like that's, you're like, that's, Whereas, people who show up with a team, have to, you know, have you experienced like, what do you do when somebody shows up and they're convinced that they're amazing? Like, I once had somebody, like, we were giving notes, you know, on a script, and so this person was yelling at Drew and I while saying how collaborative, how open to notes they are, while like literally yelling at us. I'm the most collaborative. Like, hey, you know.
All right.
So it's like, you know, when someone shows up saying like, I'm the most honest person I've ever, you know, that you'll ever meet.
Why did you mention that?
You're like, you know, who doesn't mention that?
Interesting that you felt you needed to really get that out there. Right?
How do you deal, you know, with someone who's convinced, with a showrunner who's convinced they're amazing at something, like?
Well, I mean, not even a showrunner. I think like kind of anyone in any facet. Anyone. And I think that goes for like actors. I think it goes for directors. I think it goes for executives. I think it's like we're all. I mean, I think like entertainment is very interesting and storytelling is very interesting for a lot of reasons. But I think like making the things that we make, you at once have to be very vulnerable and like be very compassionate with people, I think, but then also everything we do involves conflict. And, you know, and so like finding ways to, you know, have difficult conversations, but hopefully in the best version of it, recognize like, all right, we're going to talk about something that I know you are not going to want to talk about. And I don't want to talk about in some cases, or like, you know, or if it's like the, you know, kind of the, what you're describing where somebody is very, very sure about their point of view. You know, one thing that was helpful to me early on as an executive is, you know, the guys that I worked for at Stars, I think were very generous with advice. And then on top of that, you know, I remember someone telling me basically anyone who tells you that they know what's going to work, like they're full of shit. Like you can have your best guesses, you can do everything you're going to do, but like there is a certain degree of you just don't know, and you make the best calls and make the best product, but at a certain point, the audience is going to judge, and that was very freeing as kind of a young executive to know, like, all right, there is no definitive right answer. And I think kind of coming along with that was instilled in me early was the mentality of tie break goes to the showrunner. And I think like there are a couple things in that I especially as I've gone along, I realized are really important. And one of the most important things that you can do is bet on the right people and assemble the right team. Because you cannot, like, I am not a writer and I am not a director and like I'm certainly not an actor. And like so you like kind of can't do these jobs for people, right? And so all you can do is like find the people that you really believe have the voice, have the vision, have like the ability to shepherd this, and then support them and try to help give them guidance and feedback. But a lot of the time, like, yeah, there is no right answer. And so like I may be super certain that my point of view is the right one, whatever that means. They're super certain that their point of view is right. Honestly, I don't know. And like all I can do is try to say, consider this as you're going through it. And I think, having that stance, if you really follow through on it and you're honest about it, I think over time, even with somebody that is kind of in that stance, develops hopefully trust that you're willing to back them for something that is super important. And then frankly, have the really hard conversations about things when you're like, I really do think this is important for us to think about. And it's different for every person. Different people are going to hear things in different ways. I worked with showrunners that really have to, I would have to be very mindful of, and I try to, like, anyone that, is coming up in the business that, is learning to develop their feedback skills. I try to like tell them, think about working on something that is so near and dear to you for a very long time, and then like, and very personal to you, and then just like putting it out for everyone, especially in a non-finished way, to be like, please love this, and like have people be like, cool, but like, here's all the things that are wrong with it. And it's like, I think easy on the executive side to just try to get to a solution to a problem and forget that there are a lot of emotions wrapped up in it and a lot of pieces that, are like very close to someone. And, and so I've worked with
a lot of
self-worth,
I think for writers, like, please tell me I'm a good writer. You know what I mean? I think that's wrapped up in that too.
Oh, 100%, especially again, in a space in a world where there is no definitive answer. And this is going to be kind of this gray area, and you don't know, even in the best case scenario, when you put it out, how it's going to do. That's a really vulnerable place. So it's, I think I've worked with writers where, you really do need to remember and respect the fact that it's like, there's a lot of thought and energy and emotion that's gone into this, and like really point out that you actually there are the things that you really love about it. And to me, I think there's like, I heard like the compliment sandwich thing, which I think, if it's happening to you, you're like, yeah. Like, let's get to the meat, please.
I disagree.
But I think you have to be genuine about the bread.
Maybe that's it. It can't be just dashed off with like great job list.
Yeah. Well, exactly. I got to say, we worked on a show that they're like, well, if we don't mention it, it means it works. You know what I mean?
Right.
But sometimes, like, over the course of the notes process on that show, we'd pull something out to make room for something else. And they'd be like, well, why'd you get rid of that?
We love that.
Yeah. And we're like, well, if you never tell us the things that you feel are working, that's as helpful. How do we know? Yeah, it's as helpful of a bellwether, as the things that aren't working. From a rewrite perspective, like, it's helpful to know both things, both to know the things that the network feel are really successful and the things that aren't, because then you can be like, oh, they really like this kind of a thing. We can lean more into this direction, but just negative only doesn't like only like
not,
it's like yeah, you can only steer the car one direction. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
sure, you can still get
right.
everywhere, but you're gonna like loop around a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
You know?
And I mean, that's so true. I think even more so in the beginning of a show when like, because I worked primarily on shows that have gone straight to series. And so it's like, you don't even have the benefit in that case of like, there are definitely the pros of why that's done. And I think certain shows where it's like 100% the right way to do it. There are other times where it's like if only we could see the prototype and then like kind of take all those lessons, improve it, and then go and do the whole thing. And when you're building it as you go.
Go ahead, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just not sure what you mean, I guess. Are you talking about if something, tell me about something that goes straight to series and tell me about something that doesn't go straight to series. I mean, are you talking about like shooting a pilot and then seeing if you're going
to.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So
I wasn't sure if you just meant like a pilot script and a series order or if,
Yeah. No, 100% like actually shooting something to your point about like, the totally intangible aspect of like the actors and the chemistry. Like some of my favorite comedic shows, the first season's like a little rocky or the beginning of the first season is a little rocky until you can see the writers figured out, oh, here's the chemistry. Here's what this actor is great at. And like lean into it. And like, and then you find your rhythm. So like 100% what you're saying, as valuable as like, here's the things to note. Also, this is fucking great. This person is great at that. That's really funny. Like, I think you're helping kind of, make sure that you keep all the great stuff and improve the stuff that needs improving. But it's easy, I think, to forget that. And then I've also worked with showrunners where it's like kind of, it's the rare case, I would say, but it is, like, all right, let's just get straight to the, tell me like what the feedback is and, don't want to spend time on the other stuff. And you just have to know like, how do people, it only comes from working with people, what is their best way of talking about it, discussing, some people like really want to get into it and have like, the hour and a half, 2 hour phone call about like and unpack it. And then other people are like, give me all the notes. I'm going to go think about it. And then we'll talk again.
Oh, interesting. I thought everyone did that second one. I thought everyone just sort of went like, great, good to know. And there's always the like, hey, if you ever need clarity, just give us a holler, That's interesting. So some people will just yakety yak with you for 90 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. It's like, it's different. Every culture on every show that I've been a part of has been very different, and, I think I've loved both processes in different ways and hated both processes in different ways. I think sometimes having that collaborative conversation is totally the right move. Other times it's kind of like, feels like almost, like not productive. And that I think you need to avoid. And then sometimes like, I think that, especially depending on how people engage, there are certain people that just kind of are like, the whole way through the notes. And you're like, wow, do you hate all this? Or like, it's kind of the same thing on the other side where you're like, are my notes terrible? Like, what's going on?
Right. I hadn't even thought of that.
Little dialogue,
Yeah.
Like
sometimes when you're getting a note, you can see it right away. And then, so it gives you that good feeling like, oh, or, ooh, yeah. But a note can be fantastic even if you don't have an immediate like, oh, I see it right away. That doesn't mean it's not a great note, but I could see it being a reaction of like, I hadn't it's sort of like when John proposed to me and, it was a little bit of a fumble and I was like, huh.
It was. She was working. I had the ring for too long. Finally, I was like, oh, fuck it. I'm just going to do it. And then I got on the knee and she was like doing her day job. And she's like,
my day job, copywriting,
not here. She's like, not here.
She's like, no,
but
come back.
He said afterward, he was like, well, I was nervous. And I was like, oh my God, it literally never even occurred to me how you feel about this. Because it's so much like, I have a vision of how this is going to go for me. Like, that's the first time I'm like, oh my God, executives would feel self-conscious about my reaction to their notes? What? That's really a revelation to me.
Yeah. I mean, it's because I think the best versions of it are like a dialogue where you're like, again, you're the vision. I'm just like here to give you helpful feedback. Because I think it's like interesting, like, coming again from, a background where like I have a lot of friends who are more like code and things like that. There is very much like kind of, I mean, it's I think a very loaded phrase now, like the Facebook move fast and break things. That I think there are the bad things that come along with that. But I think there's also the like iterate quickly, and get feedback. And to a certain degree, the only part of the process that we can really, really, really do that on is the script writing stage, where you can actually move fairly quickly, get feedback at a low cost way. Mm-hmm. Once you're actually out shooting it, it's like you can do it. It's just way more expensive and it's harder, and it's more like shipping a product, where you're like, we're going to get this out into the world. And then by the time we get that feedback, it's like, well, we can't go, actually just redo season 1 to like address, the audience feedback, not that that's how you exactly always should be doing it, but it's just more like inputs and like how, getting kind of like responses, and some of them are going to be helpful and some of them are really not. And so on this side, it's like, how do you be the helpful version, and try not to fight what you're doing. And I think like that is where I would always think about it, especially on the buying side, where you maybe have not been in all the conversations leading up to the moment in the room where the pitch is happening. Mm-hmm. This is kind of the iceberg. You're like seeing this part, and there's all the stuff that has gone into everything leading up to that moment. And I think it's easy to forget that. It's also like, you're trying to get a lot of information out of a very short conversation, basically. Mm-hmm. And I've seen it be where you think that you're pulling in the same direction, but actually you get a little further apart and you're like, wait a second, how'd you guys get over there? And how'd you get over there? It looked like we were like trending in the same direction on the show that everyone wanted to make. But if you haven't had the real conversations up front, like that's, I think, where you get conflict. So it's very much like, really drilling into what is going to work for us on the network side. What is the vision that we want to sell and make on, the creative side? And how do you get those two things as close together as possible?
Did you see that documentary, Too Funny to Fail?
No.
Have we already talked about this on the podcast?
Oh, Stacey, you're a little off mic.
Am I too far away?
Yeah.
Too Funny to Fail. And forgive me if we've already talked about this on the podcast. I can't remember. It's just this hilarious documentary about the making of the Dana Carvey show. Dana Carvey was like the biggest one of the biggest guys on SNL. And then he had his own comedy show, and it was on whatever network had Home Improvement, because they came right after Home Improvement.
NBC maybe.
Yeah, it might have been NBC.
Like the writers in it, like in that room.
It was Charlie Kaufman, Louis C.K. It was Steve Carell's first job. It was Stephen Colbert's first job. It was, it was like a dream team. But talk about like creators that want to do this and a network that wants to, like, the creators seemed so like freewheeling and having fun and just like, let's be wild, that I don't think they even bothered. There's a whole hilarious bit where they show like they start doing their thing and it's so outrageous and so like dark and weird and stoner, and it came right after Home Improvement. But none of them had ever even bothered to watch Home Improvement, and when they finally did, they were like,
gosh.
"Oh, that's what they got." The very first sketch is Dana Carvey impersonating Bill Clinton, and for some reason, he's talking about the importance of breastfeeding, and involves him. This is the very first sketch. He opens up his shirt and he's got 6 nipples, and he gets live puppies, and there's a pump with milk. He gets live puppies and he's breastfeeding these puppies with milk coming out of his nipples. And of course, everyone's gone on to be this massive star. So now they can look back on it and laugh, right? But it's them looking back and just talking about the ratings, how the ratings were like, because everybody loved Dana Carvey. They were like a zillion. And during this one sketch, it's just going,
everyone clicks.
Talk about like they thought they were getting this, but they were really getting like the Eric Andre show. Oh my God, it's so funny.
That's so good. Yeah. I love that. I gotta watch that. That sounds awesome.
Delicious.
Yeah, it's really great. What kinds of problems do you think a showrunner should bring to the studio, and what kind of problems should a showrunner handle internally? Like Drew and I, we come from a home that, we grew up learning to clean up the messes, you know what I mean? In some ways. And I think, once we, got into like this, I mean, there's so many messes that, Like you're like, oh, we'll
nonstop.
fix this.
Yeah.
We'll sweep this on. Like we'll make sure. Like, and we pride ourselves on being the show that the studio and network never have to worry about. There's no problems.
Yeah.
We tend to, but then we've had, at moments, studios and networks like, why didn't you tell us that was going on? Like we could have helped. And I've thought like, what should I talk, like I almost don't even know how to ask for that kind of help.
And also, if you answer that, but then also tell us a person who's gone too far, where you're like, whoa, I'm not your therapist. I'm not the showrunner.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
but start with the good version.
Yeah. I mean, it's a tricky one because, like, I personally err on the side of, like, transparency. People do well when they have context and information. That being said, I think there are times when like too much information is not a helpful thing, especially when you're like trying. It's just like there like you said, there are like constant issues that come up. Not even like because anything's truly fundamentally dysfunctional. It's just like the very nature of doing a very complex thing for this long. Things are going to come up. Personality conflicts are going to come up with that many people. It's just inherent. And so like that's part of where I think there's a little bit of, and I feel like, anytime I've had, a team or like people reporting to me, there is certain level of like managing up, managing down that happens even within a corporate structure where it's like, having to, I think, manage things in the right way where you are shielding, kind of one direction or the other, anything that's like not helpful or distracting, in the short term and is not going to really dramatically impact things in the long term. And then there are the things where it's like, okay, if this is heading a certain direction, like, I've been in situations where it's like you have certain key creative people like core to the show where it's like all of these people need to be working well together. And not knowing when I've been in a situation where like you're like not knowing that there is starting to be a fundamental conflict amid those people until it's too late to like we passed the Rubicon. Like it is like we are now at the point where it is not really solvable on a personal level. And which is not to say that like the studio or the network is always going to be able to step in and solve everything, but it's like at least you can help to be like get to resolve things before it gets too big, or manage things ahead of time, or if it's like something budgetarily or like I mean it can kind of be anything where it's like if this continues to bubble up in the wrong way, we're going to have a very, very serious problem. I would rather know earlier that look, here's what we are worried about. Here's what we're doing to manage it. Nothing for you to do, just flagging it. Like that, I'm like, okay, now it's on my radar. We can check back in about it. Hopefully the answer is in a week. You know what? We got it under control. Or by the way, if you could help us with XYZ, I think we can manage this. Versus just getting the call where you're like, DEFCON 5 or DEFCON 1, whichever one is the worst one, it's DEFCON terrible, is, like we're here and you're like, whoa, like how did this even happen? So I think that's a long way of saying like, I don't think there is a totally right answer because you kind of have to judge each situation a little differently because, to your question, when does it happen the other way? I think there are times when like, I feel like this is something even just as an executive, like a young executive that I learned pretty quickly. You can like surface too much information, where it's like all of a sudden people are like, wait, is everything wrong? Like, and, kind of gets a little bit of a, people get concerned to a degree that they don't need to be. And I think like on the showrunner level, I've had that too, where, or like anyone on the creative side where you're like, wait, I'm hearing a lot about this stuff now. This doesn't feel like something I should be involved in. It feels like something you guys should be managing, but like, is there something deeper going on and trying to suss that out? I think you just have to be careful to not get an outsized reaction when it's not needed,
John once worked with a producer who kind of would set things on fire so that the producer could get a pat on the back when they put that fire
put it
out.
out.
Yeah.
But it happened
Oh,
over and over.
yes.
I do think sometimes we all like attention.
And it's like,
I love
everyone
it.
into the boardroom. We all need to meet in the boardroom. It's an emergency. And then it'd be like this thing. And I'd be like,
Yeah.
I think this is a fake emergency. I don't feel like this is like, can't
It
we
reminds
just...
me of last night's fake emergency.
yeah, totally. Like, I don't know why everyone's being incensed into this panic state.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
You call that like
For-
the firefighting arsonist is just
Yeah.
like, you're
Oh,
like,
yeah.
why?
I love that.
Yeah, you're
That's
just
so
like,
good.
you literally just lit the fire. Like,
Yeah.
we all have to put it
Yeah.
out. And they're like, look, I put out this fire that I started,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's like, we're going to lose the location. It's like, well, can we send a location scout out to find another one? You know, like,
Right.
problem solved, nailed
Right.
it,
Exactly.
that's,
Exactly.
there's, or, there's, often the person who shows up and is like, oh, I've been trying to do this thing and I had to do this and then do this and then do this and then do this. And you're like, oh my God, I'm spending half my day just listening to the.
You need to get married so you can bore your wife with that boring story of how you finally got that prop or location or whatever.
Yeah, totally.
Shout out to all the spouses who are listening.
Totally. Where, I could see that, and one thing you were saying that I loved is just talking about difficult conversations. And I feel like from the show running side, if you're willing to see the problems and not like hide from them and willing to have difficult conversations and lovingly and kindly and compassionately sit down with someone and be like, hey, I'm hearing, you've been really hard on the vanities and you've been really hard, if I'm hearing about it, it's becoming a thing. And like, can you try to be a little more patient with them? Like, it'll serve you in the end, to have whatever version of those conversations, like 95% of the problems just evaporate by being willing to have an open human conversation with people about, things. And, I used to say like half the job of, directing or show running is just difficult conversations and being willing to
Totally
get on the phone and just talk through uncomfortable situations sometimes.
John, one thing that
100%.
you do very well that I think is worth mentioning here, one thing you always include in your difficult conversations is you bring it around to person I'm talking to. This is why making this change will benefit you. And this is why not making this change will hurt you. It's not about the vanities feelings. I mean, it is about the vanities feelings because they're people,
Yeah.
But sort of the equivalent of you don't want people to turn against you because if the crew turns against you, your experience won't go as well and your reputation won't be as good. Do you know what I mean? Like, you had the difficult conversation, and for most people, it's just enough to hear that, like, oh, wow, I'll definitely change. But if anyone's stubborn, you always include the, this is why it will help you personally to change.
Well, and it's true. It's like, I feel like all of us are relying on the relationships, you can fight the studio over a line of dialogue. And you can be like, I'm going scorched earth. This line of dialogue is so important. And then it gets cut in post. You know what I mean? And you're like, and I just, or you can be like, hey, the relationship is worth more than this particular detail I'm totally fixated on. And, or, sometimes you get a note. My favorite notes are the notes where you're like, oh, I should have thought of that. That's such a good... Like, that was just like outside of my field of view, but like it rings true immediately. And then there's the notes that I'm like, oh, I don't know how it rings true. And I realize now I was maybe avoiding writing that because for whatever reason, I have resistance. It scares me to write in that space. Like, I don't know how authentic I'll be for that,
Right.
And I may feel my initial impulse might be like, no, like they can't, I can't, I don't want to do that. Yeah. But then you realize oh, this is the thing I was scared of, but it's so right. And I needed that help. And I feel like we all have, I don't know, both sides of that.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I feel like notes are meant to take you from good to great, but there's always the risk that it's going to take you from good to shitty. Because maybe you won't get it right. Maybe you'll hack at that scene and just for some reason, nobody's perfect. So it is scary to change, but
Yeah.
Totally building off that, like one of the things when you're on the side of giving the notes that you're always scared of if you do like, and I'm always, cautious about giving a note that you're like, all right, we take a swing in the wrong direction and it's not something that you can tell that like the creative team really fundamentally gets and believes in and is behind. Very good chance that you're going to go from good, like decent to bad. And then the
Ooh.
worst thing is to be like, okay, can we actually just go back to the old version? It's kind of like a bad, I think, momentum thing. It's bad. It's just, you never want to be in the scenario where you're like actually, making, guiding things into a direction that is going to be worse. And I think that's like truly to me, part of that and why I think the best versions of it are a bit of a dialogue.
Yeah.
Like my favorite phone calls and my favorite notes conversations are the ones where we get on and we're like, all right, kind of giving a note in this direction. And then you hear what the team has to say and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, no, 100% that direction. Where you're
Oh,
like,
wow.
now that I understand what you're saying and what you're going for, forget that. It's actually 100% the opposite. Like, and like, let's chase that direction. And I feel like that's a lot of trying to get to the core of what's the intention? What do you want to come across? Because if you're not addressing like the fundamental and just trying to address the top layer,
Right.
a lot of time you get people trying to like, they don't understand. I mean, understandably, it's like not totally getting why are we talking about this, or like, you're kind of pushing it in a direction that doesn't totally make sense, but trying to actually be collaborative. And you can actually, in a weird way, in a collaborative setting, get into a bad scenario that way. So I think it does become like, all right, how do you drill down into the real thing? Like people say the note behind the note, but like really kind of get to the core of what are you trying to do? Let us help like respond to that.
I've been
I
surprised
love
at
that.
how not prescriptive notes are. I've been, even when you ask, like, go ahead, just lay it on me, make it pretty, just tell me what to do. I'm a monkey, I'll dance, I don't care. And how they still come out often like a haiku. The notes are like, wow, that's sort of dreamy. But John and Drew have been pointing out to me, because I'm in the process of taking some notes now and wrapping my brain around it. They're like, what do you say? What is your friend? Ambiguity is your friend. Like slightly ambiguous notes are your friend because they sort of present, like here's the spirit of the note. And then I then have the freedom to wrap my mind around it. I'm starting to understand why prescriptive is not actually all that helpful. Why a little more poetic in the notes is actually something that my own brain can go, oh, I got what you mean. Whoop, here's my version.
Yeah. And give you space to play, I think, at the best version. And then I think there is, there still is the moment for pretty prescriptive notes. It's just
Sure,
like,
of course.
I remember the first time I started doing it, I had like 3 pages of notes that I was ready to send. And at the time, the guys were like, no. pick 4 things that you actually care about and let's talk about those. And that was, again,
that's great.
Like, oh yeah, that would suck and probably not be super helpful to get like a wall of notes like that.
That reminds me of, do you ever have a friend, this might be a girl thing, I've had my girlfriends go like, look at this shit going down with my boyfriend, and they'll show it to me and all I see is that their part of the text thread goes on and on and on. And I don't even know what was said, but I know that I can go to my friend like, girl, the
volume is too much.
The volume is all that matters. The volume is the headline. And I think that can be true for notes too.
Well, and I feel like
100%.
To your point too, like just learning, I feel like there's a whole, I don't know, skill set or craft to learning to interpret notes in like, there's certain coded language, like, really take your time, getting this draft right, or like things like that. You're like, oh, they're asking for bigger changes. You know what I mean? Or there's all these like little kind of coded phrases where you're like, oh, I know. Okay, they want something more different than a couple tweaks. You know what I mean? Or they're more afraid that we'll break it if we do anything. So they're trying to give very light, you know what I mean? Like making that clear.
This is just a calibration. This is just a calibration.
Yeah,
that's sort of the opposite where it means, don't break it.
And there's all kinds of, or, often like you get a note on a scene and the note may, ask for something over here, and you may be like, okay, the scene is the issue. It's not, necessarily that solution. And what are some different ways we could do that? Like, I see what the issue here that they're having, and sometimes it's worth following up and being like, okay, talk me through what the problem is. And sometimes there's just a basic misunderstanding of the intent of the scene. And it's like,
Totally.
oh, we weren't clear in our articulation of this scene.
Yeah.
We wrote this, they're seeing this totally different thing. Like, we just need to shore up the, scene descriptions, or, and sometimes the biggest note can turn into something that inconsequential. And sometimes the smallest note is actually a much bigger you know what I mean? And
Yeah, exactly. Those ones that you kind of drop and they don't seem that, that those are always, I feel like, the more like interesting ones too, where you kind of have one note and then it doesn't seem like it would be a big thing. But then when you really all think about it, you're like, well, yeah, that's a lot, and, I think there are times when that's necessary. And then a lot of the time where you kind of have to step back and say, all right, like, what are we actually working within? What is the show we're all trying to make? And I think, again, that goes back to the conversations at the beginning where it's like, as much as you can, all be shooting for the same target, is really, I think a tricky thing, but I think, if you have the conversations in the right way, understand each other, work through the coded language like you're talking about, then I think you can get there.
When I think communication, as long as there's communication, like, I feel like you can solve, you know what I mean? Like, you can really find your way through if there's good communication going on. I remember the last show we were working on, I had a scheduled call every Friday. I would, talk to the exec, and we would just sort of talk through anything going on. And it was great. And, we got to know each other as like friends, you know what I mean? And talk about our weekends.
Those are the best ones.
Yeah. And it was great. Yeah. And, it was a really, a fun weekly chance to, just touch base. And I found, that those relationships can be very, very helpful. And frankly, like in the writer's room, sometimes the whole room starts moving in a direction, and you sort of go down a path, and then you get to where you've been driving for a week or two, and you're like, oh, this is unruly. And network or studio gives you notes, and you're like, they're like, hey, can you simplify this? And that can be really helpful, like, they really want us to, like, don't mind the direction I was driving the car, the last 2 weeks. The network really wants us to, do this other thing. And, it can save us from ourselves, a lot of the time too.
John, you and I were both out of the room for a few days on a project we were working on. I was off on draft. You were off, doing other stuff. And when we both came back in, the 11-year-old was taking psychedelic mushrooms by accident and being chased by a bear. And it really was like, what the fuck happened? Wow.
That's incredible.
It's been a blue sky kind of 3 days.
Please walk me through. How did we get here?
Yeah, totally. Sorry, what were you going to say though, Ken? What were you
please.
Say?
What was I? It's fallen out of my brain with the 11-year-old with the psychedelic mushrooms in the bear.
By accident, just going to reiterate, accidental mushrooms.
Accidental, of course. No, I think what I was going to say is, I think, what you're describing though, I think takes an openness on both sides to like, I feel like you talk to some people, I feel like, whether it's some people on the executive side or some writers, because, I would say the majority of our friends are writers, directors, creative people, and obviously a lot of executives as well. But it's interesting when you talk to everyone, I think there can be this kind of like very low key distrust of the other side. And I think like when people come in with this, like, let's assume this is going to be a positive collaborative environment until proven otherwise. I think that you can get to the place that you're talking about where you have that exchange, and especially like, where people are frankly trusting each other to do their respective roles and their respective jobs. It kind of reminds me, I have like a childhood friend who ended up, being more on the venture capital side, and we got to talking, we were kind of like both getting started in our careers. And I was describing what I would do in terms of working with showrunners and hearing pitches and things like that. And he was describing what he would do on the VC side. We were like, this sounds actually really similar. You're
Wow.
kind of like, how do we find somebody that has a kind of wild vision that you're willing to bet many millions of dollars on because you believe in their vision, what they want to do, and you believe that they're going to be able to infect a ton of other people with that vision. And but part of it that's similar on this side is like, it's always interesting to hear people talk on that side. It's like a similar thing where like, here for advice, giving you advice, whether it's somebody on the board or just like from kind of like an investor position. But like, if they're ever getting in and having to tinker in the company itself, like usually that's a bad thing. And I feel like on this side too, it's kind of like understanding the roles of like, how much can you like support, like, and like give feedback, but like at the end of the day, you got to trust, like, that people are going to go, and make something great. And it's kind of, yeah, you got to have it kind of both ways on that side. And I think when you can find that kind of, I guess, partnership, like, between those two sides, like, I think those have been, some of the best experiences I've had and some of the best shows I've had, whether on the network side, the studio side, like, kind of in whatever role, when you can find that combination of people, and that way of working, it's like, that's where you get great stuff, I think.
I love that. Well, this has been, amazing. So I'll say in summary, like, one thing we talked about, Ken mentioned, 4 things, he looks for in showrunners are, vision and voice, having a North Star, team building, decisiveness, and being, I can't read what I wrote.
Nimble.
Being nimble.
Being nimble. I
Being
stole that
nimble.
one from you.
Yeah, that's so good.
So everybody just do that.
Yep.
There you go. It's super easy.
If you like our show, please consider taking a minute to subscribe and rate us wherever you get your podcasts, and please tell a friend. That really helps us find our audience. Thank you so much, Ken. This has been a pleasure.
Yeah, so much fun.
Talking
really
with you.
fun.
And
Super interesting.
really helpful.
Yeah.
Like I feel like I've learned a lot. These are questions I've always wanted to ask, but never had a venue for that. So thank you for that. This is really helpful.
Bye.